She had $43 left in her account, a dead grandfather's debt-ridden land, and 18 half-starved bison that every serious rancher in the county said would be dead before Christmas. They laughed at her face. They laughed behind her back. The cattle king of the entire frontier told her, to her face, that she was too young, too stupid, and too broke to survive a single winter. He wasn't entirely wrong about the broke part, but here's what none of them knew. Her grandfather had left her something worth more than money, and the land itself was about to prove every single one of them wrong. Stay with me until the end of this story, because what happens next will change how you see everything. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and become part of our family. You don't want to miss what's coming. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning her grandfather died, Sienna Rowan was 3 states away, folding hotel laundry for $11 an hour and wondering if she'd ever figure out what she was supposed to do with her life. She got the call at 6:14 a.m. Her phone buzzed off the edge of the ironing board and she caught it before it hit the floor. Muscle memory from too many months in too many budget motels, working jobs that paid just enough to keep her from going home. "Miss Rowan?" The voice on the other end was professional, tired, the kind of voice that delivered bad news regularly and had learned to pace itself. "This is Alan Pruitt from Pruitt and Gaines Law Office in Hadley County. I'm calling regarding your grandfather, Thomas Rowan. I'm very sorry to inform you that he passed away yesterday evening." She sat down on the floor between 2 laundry carts. She hadn't spoken to her grandfather in almost 2 years. Not because of any real falling out, more like the slow, passive kind of distance that grows when 2 people are both too stubborn to pick up the phone first. She'd sent him a postcard from New Mexico once. He'd probably kept it. "He left everything to you," the lawyer continued. "The ranch, the land, whatever equipment remains. I'll need you to come out here and sign some paperwork when you're ready." Sienna pressed her back against the laundry cart and stared at the ceiling. The fluorescent light above her flickered twice, then held. "How much debt?" she asked. A pause. "That's something we should discuss in person." That was never a good sign. She drove out to Hadley County in a truck that burned oil and needed a new alternator belt she couldn't afford to replace. The heater worked intermittently. She stopped twice for gas and once to check the engine using a flashlight with dying batteries. 12 hours of driving gave her a lot of time to think about what she was walking into. She'd been to the ranch as a kid, summers mostly, when her mother was between relationships and needed somewhere to park her for a few weeks. Her grandfather had been a lean, quiet man who didn't explain himself much. He'd shown her how to read weather from cloud formations, how to check a water table by the color of the soil, how to tell which grasses were native and which ones were invasive by the way they moved in the wind. She'd mostly been annoyed at the time, the way kids are annoyed by anything that doesn't involve screens or social events. She wished now she'd paid better attention. The ranch, when she finally turned onto the unpaved access road at just past midnight, looked smaller than she remembered. Smaller and older, and more tired. The main house was still standing, but the front porch sagged on one side and someone had patched the roof with mismatched shingles that had since warped. 3 of the fence posts along the drive were leaning at angles that suggested they'd given up on standing straight a long time ago. She parked, sat in the truck for a minute, and breathed. Then she went inside and found her grandfather's journals on the shelf beside the fireplace. There were 11 of them, handwritten, the pages swelled with humidity and age. Some of the entries dated back 40 years. She didn't read them that first night. She was too exhausted and too hollow. But she pulled the most recent one off the shelf and set it on the kitchen table before she went to sleep. The debt, as it turned out, was manageable. Barely. The land itself was mortgaged at a moderate level, and the lawyer, a flat-faced, straightforward man who seemed genuinely sorry for her situation, laid it out plainly. She had 6 months before the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings if she couldn't demonstrate viable use of the property. The equipment was old. There were no animals. The previous grazing contracts her grandfather had held had all lapsed. "What did he do these last few years?" she asked. "To make money?" Pruitt shuffled some papers. "Honestly, not much. He sold off the cattle operation about 4 years ago, spent most of his time doing research, I suppose you'd call it, writing. He had some ideas about the land. What kind of ideas? The kind that didn't make him popular at the feed store. He said it without cruelty, just factually. She drove back to the ranch, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the journal. The first livestock auction she attended in Hadley County, Sienna already knew she didn't belong. It wasn't a hostile feeling exactly, more like the particular discomfort of walking into a room where everyone knows each other and you're the only one who doesn't know the jokes. Ranchers in worn boots and good hats, talking in a shorthand that came from spending whole lives in the same county. She wore her cleanest jeans and a flannel that had belonged to her grandfather. It still smelled faintly of wood smoke. She'd gone to look at equipment, maybe some used fencing materials. She had a rough budget of around $800, the last of what she'd saved from the laundry job, and she was trying to be practical. She was not, under any circumstances, going to do anything impulsive. The bison came up for auction mid-morning. There were 18 of them, loaded into a temporary pen at the far end of the auction yard, and the noise around them dropped the moment they walked in. Not because people were impressed, because the animals were in bad shape, visibly thin, coats dull, moving with the careful lethargy of animals that had stopped expecting things to get better. They'd come from a failed operation up north, the auctioneer explained with barely concealed boredom. No reserve price. The seller just needed them gone. The crowd found this funny. "Somebody want 18 problems?" a man near Sienna said, loud enough for the row in front of him to laugh. The bidding started at $400 for the lot. Nobody moved. Sienna thought about her grandfather's journal. She'd read it twice by then, at the kitchen table with bad coffee, and the kind of focused attention she'd never given it when he was alive to explain it. He'd written about bison with a specificity that surprised her. Not romantically, not sentimentally, but practically. The way they grazed, the way their hooves worked the soil differently than cattle, the way native prairie grass responded to them. He'd believed something the ranching community around him had dismissed entirely, and he'd spent years trying to prove it on land that no longer had the animals to prove it with. She raised her hand. $450, she said. The auctioneer looked at her with the particular expression of a man who is professionally required not to show surprise but is definitely surprised. $450 for the lot. Do I have 5? Silence. Sold. The man who'd made the joke turned to look at her. He was maybe 55, broad-shouldered, wearing a hat that probably cost more than her truck. He had the kind of face that expected to be listened to. "You just bought yourself a pile of dead animals, sweetheart," he said. Not aggressively. Almost kindly, in the way that's worse than aggression, because it assumes you're too naive to be worth getting angry at. "I know what I bought," she said. "Harvey Cole." He offered his hand, which she shook. "I run the coal operation. 12,000 head of cattle, 3 ranches. I'm telling you this so you understand that I've been in this business since before you were born. Those animals are done. The one on the far right won't make it through the week." "Then I paid $25 for it," she said. He laughed. It was a genuine laugh, not a mean one, which somehow made it worse. "How old are you?" 23. "And you're running the Rowan place? Thomas's granddaughter?" He looked at her differently then. Not kinder exactly, but with more context. "Your grandfather was a good man, had some unusual ideas. I tried to help him out a few times, offered to take the land off his hands at a fair price. He always said no." He paused. "Offer still stands, if you want it." "No, thank you." He shrugged, settled his hat. "Well, enjoy your bison." He walked away. Around her, she heard the conversation spreading, the way news moves through a small community. Not quickly, but thoroughly. The Rowan girl bought the sick bison, Thomas's granddaughter. Tried to tell her. Won't listen. She stood there and watched her 18 bison stand in their pen, and she tried to feel something other than terrified. She mostly failed. The first week was exactly as bad as it should have been. Getting 18 bison from the auction yard to a ranch without a working livestock trailer of her own involved calling in a favor from a neighboring rancher named Dennis Yarby, who had a trailer and charged her a reasonable amount for the haul, but made clear, in a polite and exhausted way, that he thought she was making a mistake. "Not my business," he said, loading the ramp. "But those animals need a vet before they need a pasture." She knew that. She'd already called the vet, a woman named Dr. Carla Shen, who drove a dusty pickup and had the no-nonsense delivery of someone who'd stopped softening bad news for clients sometime in her 3rd year of practice. "Two of them are borderline," Carla said, walking the pen with a flashlight and a clipboard. "The one on the end, the big female, she's actually better than she looks. They're malnourished but not diseased, which is something. What are you feeding them?" "Whatever the land has," Sienna said. "I'm going to rotate them through the pastures the way my grandfather mapped it out." Carla looked at her. "The old journal system? You knew about it?" "Thomas talked to me about it a few times. I told him I couldn't evaluate whether it'd work from a veterinary standpoint, because no one around here had tried it." She paused. "I still can't tell you if it'll work." "But," Carla made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, "but I've been watching cattle operations in this county for 15 years, and the land is getting worse every decade, not better, so I don't know what the right answer is." She capped her pen. "Call me if any of them go down, and get some sleep. You look terrible." Eli Mercer showed up on the 4th day. He was 16, maybe 17, Sienna wasn't sure, with the kind of teenager face that was still deciding what it was going to look like. He appeared at her fence line on a bicycle with a broken kickstand, a backpack that looked overstuffed for a casual visit, and the particular energy of someone who had been rehearsing what they were going to say and was trying not to look like it. "I live on the Mercer place," he said. 2 miles east. I heard you bought the Bison. Word travels fast. It travels real fast when Harvey Cole is involved." He looked at the pasture behind her. "Can I see them?" She studied him for a moment. "Why?" "Because nobody else around here has any." She couldn't argue with that. He came in, stood at the fence line, and watched the herd with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested rather than looking for something to criticize. He asked 3 questions in the first 5 minutes. Specific, intelligent questions about grazing rotation and soil recovery. And she found herself answering them fully before she'd decided whether to trust him. "My dad thinks you're going to lose the ranch by spring," he said. "Not cruelly, just reporting." "What do you think?" He considered this. "I think the journals might be right. I read about Alan Savory and what he proved in Zimbabwe, about how grazing animals can actually restore grassland if you manage the timing. Your grandfather was doing something similar, wasn't he?" She looked at this teenager standing at her fence in the autumn light. "Do you want a job?" He blinked. "I'm 16. "I know. I can pay you $40 a day and lunch. It'll mostly be fence repair and watching animals and doing things that are boring and sometimes physically unpleasant." He didn't hesitate. "Yeah, okay." Yeah. The community meeting at the Hadley County Grange Hall happened 3 weeks after the auction, and Sienna wasn't invited so much as informed. A flyer left in her mailbox about a regional land and water planning discussion that everyone understood was partly an opportunity for people to express opinions about decisions being made in the area. She went anyway. She sat in the back row. Harvey Cole sat in the front, as he always did. Not because anyone assigned him there, but because a man who runs 12,000 head of cattle in a county with 4,000 residents has a gravity that naturally positions him at the center of rooms. The meeting covered drought projections, water rights, grazing allotments. Then someone, she didn't catch who, mentioned the Rowan place, and the conversation shifted. "Bison don't belong on cultivated range," said a rancher named Prentice Webb, who had the voice of someone used to county meetings. "They'll tear up the fencing, push through boundaries, disrupt adjacent operations." "They already broke through my east fence once," said another rancher, a woman named Margaret Lyle, though her tone was more frustrated than hostile. "I'll repair the fence," Sienna said from the back. The room turned. She stood up. She hadn't planned to speak. "I'll repair any fence they break. That's my responsibility, and I'll meet it. What I won't do is tell you that I'm going to fail, because I don't know that yet. My grandfather spent years developing this grazing model. I'm implementing it. You're welcome to disagree with it." Harvey Cole turned in his chair and looked at her with something that had shifted since the auction. Not respect exactly, but a kind of recalibration. like he was adjusting the number he'd assigned her. "The drought projections are bad," he said. "If we get the summer they're predicting, you're going to lose those animals and the land both." "Maybe," she said, "or maybe not." Nobody in the room looked like they believed her. She was 23 years old, she was broke, and she'd spent her last savings on sick bison. She understood why they didn't believe her. She drove home in the dark, eating a gas station sandwich, thinking about her grandfather's handwriting in the margins of his journals. "The prairie knows what it's doing. Our job is to stop preventing it." She parked, sat in the truck, and let herself feel the fear for a few minutes. Then she went inside, opened the next journal, and kept reading. Outside in the dark pasture, she could hear the bison moving, heavy and slow and alive. She left the light on. The fence broke for the third time in 2 weeks on a Tuesday morning, and Sienna found out about it the same way she found out about most things that went wrong on the ranch, by walking outside before sunrise with her coffee and discovering something that wasn't supposed to be happening. 3 of the bison had pushed through the east boundary line where the wooden posts had rotted at the base without anyone noticing, and they were standing in the narrow strip of open land that separated her property from Margaret Lyle's cattle operation. They weren't causing damage. They were just standing there in the gray pre-dawn light. The largest one, a female Sienna had started privately calling Mabel, though she would have denied it to anyone who asked, chewing slow and deliberate like she had nowhere to be and no opinion about the fence she'd just walked through. Sienna set her coffee on the porch railing and went to get the wire. She'd gotten faster at fence repair over the past month. Not good at it, exactly. She still cut her hands more than she should, still underestimated how much tension the wire needed, still occasionally drove a staple in crooked and had to pull it and start over. But she was faster. Eli had taught her a better technique for setting posts in hard ground, and she'd stopped fighting the process the way she had in the beginning, when every small failure felt like confirmation that she was in over her head. The bison watched her work. Mabel stood about 8 feet away with the incurious calm of an animal that has decided a person is not a threat, but is also not interesting enough to engage with. "I'm not moving you," Sienna said to her. "You're going back in when I'm done." Mabel blinked. It took 40 minutes to patch the section, another 20 to walk the 3 animals back through the gate. By the time Sienna got back to the porch, her coffee was cold, and the sun was coming up orange over the eastern hills, the kind of morning that looked prettier than it had any right to when you were tired and your hands were bleeding from 2 small wire cuts. She drank the cold coffee anyway. She didn't have time to make more. Eli arrived at 7:30 on his bicycle, the backpack still overstuffed with what she'd eventually discovered was a rotating collection of library books, 2 granola bars, and a battered notebook where he kept observations about the herd in handwriting so small it required effort to read. He'd started doing that on his own, without her asking, tracking which animals grazed where, how long they stayed in each section, what the grass looked like before and after. She'd found the notebook once when he left it on the fence post and read through it with the particular feeling of discovering someone is more capable than you'd estimated. "East fence again?" he said, looking at her hands. "Third time. The posts are shot for about 60 feet in that section. We need to replace them, not just patch." "I know. I'm working on the budget." He dropped his bike against the barn wall and didn't say anything else about the budget, which she appreciated. He was 16, but he understood without being told that certain conversations about money had a ceiling and pushing past it didn't help anyone. They spent the morning rotating the herd into the second pasture section, the one her grandfather's journals called the South Quarter, a stretch of land that had been heavily grazed and then left alone for 11 months before Sienna arrived. It was coming back slower than the first section. The native grasses were thin in patches, replaced by invasive species that her grandfather had documented carefully, writing their names in both common and scientific terms with the patience of a man who believed the details mattered. "Buffalo grass doesn't force its way back," he'd written in one of the middle journals. "It waits. What we can do is stop preventing it." The bison moved into the South Quarter with the kind of group confidence that Sienna had started to notice. Not panicked, not chaotic, but purposeful in the way that large animals moving together become purposeful, like a current that knows where it's going. They spread out within the first 10 minutes, which was what they were supposed to do. Cattle tended to cluster, graze one area to nothing, move on and repeat the damage. Bison, moving naturally, distributed their pressure across a wider area and kept moving before any one spot was destroyed. It looked simple. It wasn't. My dad asked again how long you're planning to run this operation, Eli said. He was leaning on the fence, watching the herd settle. He said it like he was reporting information, not endorsing it. What did you tell him? I said I didn't know. That's the honest answer. He thinks you should sell before the bank gets involved. A pause. He's not trying to be mean about it. He just thinks the numbers don't add up. Sienna watched Mabel find a section of grass and drop her head to it. The numbers don't add up yet, she said. That's different. Eli wrote something in his notebook. She didn't ask what. By the time Dr. Carla Shen came out for her monthly check in mid-November, the herd had changed enough that Carla stood at the pasture fence for a long moment without saying anything, which was unusual for a woman who typically spoke in the functional, economical sentences of someone billing by the hour. They look better, she finally said. They are better. The one I was worried about. The small male on the end. He's gained weight. You can see it in the shoulders. Carla nodded slowly. What are you feeding them beyond the pasture rotation? Nothing. That's the whole point. She looked at Sienna, then back at the herd, then wrote something on her clipboard that she didn't share. The two in the middle section are pregnant, she said. Did you know that? Sienna blinked. No. You've got calves coming in the spring. Carla allowed herself a small, contained smile. Congratulations, your dead herd is reproducing. That night, Sienna sat at the kitchen table with 3 of the journals open and a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm, and she felt something she hadn't felt since she'd arrived. Something that wasn't quite optimism, because optimism seemed too light a word for it. More like the first solid evidence that the ground beneath her feet might actually be able to hold weight. She found a passage her grandfather had written about bison reproduction. The margin notes tight and excited in a way his normal entries weren't. When they start reproducing in the pasture, the land has accepted them. Pay attention to where the calves are born. Bison choose the healthiest ground for calving. They know things we don't. She closed the journal and looked out the window into the dark. Okay, Grandpa, she said quietly. I'm paying attention. The winter came hard and early, which in Hadley County meant something different than it meant in cities. It meant frozen water lines that burst at 3 a.m. It meant loading hay in temperatures that made your face hurt, except Sienna was barely using supplemental hay, which was the part that was supposed to be impossible. It meant roads that turned impassable after the second week of December, and the particular silence of a place so quiet you could hear weather moving in from miles away. She learned things that winter she hadn't expected to learn. She learned that bison find food under snow in ways that cattle don't, sweeping with their massive heads, breaking through the crust to the dormant grasses beneath. She learned that they were warmer than cattle in cold weather, their bodies generating heat in a way that didn't require the energy expenditure she'd expected. She learned that the land, or at least this particular piece of it, had a rhythm she was starting to recognize. She also learned that she could go 6 days without talking to another person without entirely losing her mind, though it was close on the 6th day. She started reading her grandfather's journals out loud in the evenings, which felt strange for the first week and then became normal. It was like hearing him talk. He'd had opinions about almost everything, not in the combative way that some people did, but in the considered, careful way of someone who had spent years actually looking at things and forming conclusions from what he saw. One entry stopped her cold. Harvey Cole's father offered to buy this land in 1987 for a price that would have set me up for the rest of my life. I nearly took it. I didn't because I'd already started to understand what this land could be, and I was afraid that if I sold it, that knowledge would die with me. Now I wonder if I was right to hold on. The work is slow, and I am not young. I hope whoever comes after me finds these journals. I hope they have more patience than sense, because this kind of work requires exactly that. Sienna read it twice, then closed the book carefully and set it on the table. I found them, she said to no one. I'm trying. The first real test came in February. A late storm rolled through Hadley County with the particular viciousness of late-season weather that has nothing left to prove and does it anyway. Sienna was out checking the east fence. She'd finally replaced the rotted posts in that section the week before, spending money she'd moved from the emergency column of her budget to the necessary column. When the temperature dropped 15 degrees in under 2 hours, and the sky went from overcast to genuinely dangerous. She got back to the barn before the worst of it hit. Eli was already there. He'd biked over before school started and hadn't been able to leave when the roads went bad. And they spent the next 4 hours in the barn with the radio on and the space heater running, watching the snow come sideways past the window. "Are they okay out there?" Eli asked. He'd been checking his notebook calculations against the window, like the math might tell him something the weather wouldn't. "They're bison," Sienna said. "They were built for this." "Built for it doesn't mean can't be hurt by it." "No, it doesn't." She poured him a cup of hot chocolate from the thermos she'd started keeping in the barn for exactly this kind of afternoon. "If we go out in this, we create more problems than we solve. We stay." He accepted the cup and looked at the window. "When did you stop panicking about every bad thing that happened out there?" She thought about it. "I'm not sure I have. I just got better at not showing it." He almost smiled. "That's not comforting." "It's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be honest." The storm broke by early evening. They went out with flashlights and found the herd in the northwest corner of the main pasture, clustered not out of fear, but out of the practical warmth of proximity, their shaggy coats already shedding the snow in the way that still surprised her, the way the cold just ran off them like water. She counted 18, all present. She'd done the count twice before she let herself breathe. The two pregnant females stood slightly apart from the others, heads down, calm. "They're fine," Eli said. He wrote the count in his notebook. "Yeah." She shone her flashlight across the pasture. The snow had settled in a particular way, disturbed in areas where the bison had swept through it to graze, uniform and smooth in sections they'd left alone. In the beam of the flashlight, she could see the difference between the areas they'd grazed and the areas they hadn't, a pattern she'd been watching develop for months. Underneath the disturbed sections, when the snow melted, the grass would be different. She knew that now. She'd watched it happen in the fall rotation, watched the buffalo grass come back thicker, watched the soil change color in a way that Carla had actually photographed and sent to a colleague at the State Agricultural Extension Office. The colleague had been interested, cautiously, scientifically interested, which was different from enthusiastic, but it was something. By early March, word had gotten around in the way it always did. Not because Sienna was talking, she wasn't, but because small communities are observational by nature, and people in Hadley County had been watching her land the way they watched anything that defied expectation. Margaret Lyle had come by twice, officially to discuss the east fence proximity, but really, Sienna suspected, to look at the pasture. Prentice Webb had driven slowly past the access road twice in a week, which in the information economy of a rural county amounted to a public statement. Harvey Cole came in person. She saw his truck, expensive, newer than anything else on the road in this part of the county, pull up to the gate on a Thursday afternoon in mid-March. She was pulling wire from a spool near the barn and almost dropped it. She didn't go to him right away. She finished the section she was working on, set the spool down, wiped her hands on her jeans, and then walked to the gate. He was standing outside his truck, hands in his coat pockets, looking at the main pasture. His hat was pulled low against the wind. She stopped at the gate and waited. "Your fence line on the south boundary is in better shape than it was in October," he said, without turning toward her. "We replaced the posts." "I can see that." He was quiet for a moment. "The grass in the main section looks different." "It is different." Now he turned. He had the expression of a man who has been correct about many things over many decades and has learned that being correct is actually not as satisfying as it's supposed to be. "My grandfather ran cattle on land that looked like this when I was young," he said, "before the numbers got too big for the land to handle." He looked at the pasture again. "I told myself the land was just changing, that it was drought or weather cycles." "It might have been some of that too," she said. "That's generous of you." "It's accurate." He looked at her with the measuring expression she'd first seen at the auction in October. "I'm not here to tell you that you were right," he said. "I'm not ready to say that yet." "Then why are you here?" "To look." He said it simply. "My wife thinks I spend too much time deciding what I think before I've actually looked at something. She's usually right." He glanced back at the pasture. "Your herd looks healthier than the animals I saw at auction." "They are. The grass in the third section, east side. That's buffalo grass coming back in, isn't it?" She was surprised he knew it. "Yes." He nodded slowly, once. Then he got back in his truck without another word and drove away. She stood at the gate and watched the truck until it turned onto the county road and disappeared. Then she turned around and looked at her pasture. At the returning grasses, the healthy herd moving in the thin afternoon light, the soil that was slowly becoming something different than what it had been when she arrived. It looked nothing like success. Not yet. The debt was still there. The bank's 6-month window had extended only because she'd demonstrated active operation, and she was still eating peanut butter sandwiches for lunch more days than not, and driving a truck that needed work she couldn't afford. Nothing about her situation was neat, but the land was answering. Slowly, on its own terms, in ways that couldn't be rushed or argued with or purchased. Her grandfather had been right about that. Maybe about all of it. And the evidence was accumulating in the way that real evidence does, not dramatically, but steadily, like water working on stone. The first calf was born on a cold morning in late March in the northwest corner of the main pasture, in the exact area where the native grass had come back strongest. Sienna and Eli found it together, standing on unsteady legs next to its mother, in the gray early light with frost still on the fence rails. Eli stood very still. He'd been around livestock his whole life. Born to a ranching family, he knew what calves looked like, what they meant, how routine the process was when it was healthy. But he stood still anyway, watching. "She picked that spot," he said quietly. "Your grandfather wrote that they do that." "He did." "Did you believe it when you read it?" She thought about that. "I believed he believed it." The calf was dark brown, almost black in the early light, and already steady on its feet in the way that prey animals had to be steady fast. The mother stood close without hovering, which Sienna had read was characteristic. Bison mothers present but not anxious, trusting the ground they'd chosen. Eli finally wrote something in his notebook. She saw him underline it twice. She didn't ask what it was. Some things didn't need to be explained. She drove to town that afternoon for supplies. Wire, 2 new posts, a bag of coffee that she actually allowed herself this time, rather than the cheaper brand. And at the feed store, she encountered Prentice Webb near the back where the mineral supplements were shelved. He nodded at her with an expression that had changed subtly since October. Not friendlier, exactly. More careful, like he was revising a calculation. "Heard you've got calves coming," he said. "First one this morning." He made a sound that wasn't quite approval, but wasn't dismissal either. "Herd's holding up better than I expected through the winter." "Better than I expected too, honestly." That seemed to surprise him, that she'd admit it. "Your grandfather ever get a calf from that land?" "Not from Bison. He had cattle before. But this is the first Bison calf on Rowan land, yeah." Webb looked at the shelving in front of him for a moment. "Thomas was a strange man," he said. "Stubborn. Used to drive me crazy at meetings." A pause. "He was usually right, though, about the land. I didn't always want to admit that." He picked up what he'd come for and moved toward the register without continuing. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't an endorsement. It was just a man adjusting his position in small increments, the way people did when the evidence made it necessary. Sienna paid for her supplies, loaded them into the truck, and drove back to the ranch through the late afternoon light. The hills in this part of the county had a particular color in March. Brown still, mostly, but with that first suggestion of green underneath, the kind of color that you'd miss if you weren't looking. She'd learned to look. She got back to find Eli sitting on the fence rail with his notebook, watching the herd. The calf was still close to its mother, but more confident now, moving in short exploratory bursts that made it look like it was testing the hypothesis of its own legs. The rest of the herd had arranged themselves in a loose ring around the mother and calf, not crowding, not threatening, just present in the way that a community is present, which is to say, with an awareness that doesn't need to be stated. Second female is close, Eli said. I think by the end of the week. Sienna sat on the fence next to him. She was tired in the particular full-body way that came from months of work without enough rest, and she was worried about three things simultaneously in the background, the way she always was now, and her hand still had the wire cuts that didn't fully heal because there was always more fence to fix. None of that had changed, but the calf was there, on ground that had been written off as worthless less than a year ago, and the grass beneath its feet was coming back in ways she had documented and photographed and sent to Carla, who had sent it on to the extension office. And the land that everyone in this county had looked at for years and seen nothing in was doing something that nobody had expected. She looked out over the pasture. The light was getting low, going gold at the edges. Do you think it's actually working? Eli asked. He was 16, and sometimes the question underneath his questions was, is this real, or am I letting myself believe something that isn't there? Sienna understood that question. She'd been asking it every day since October. I think it's working, she said. I think it's slow and it's hard and it's going to keep being hard. And I think we're about 8 months into something that takes years. But yeah. She looked at the calf, small and dark and alive on the returning grass. I think it's working. Eli wrote something in his notebook. Underlined it again. The wind came across the pasture from the west, carrying the particular smell of thawing ground and dry grass and something else. Something older, harder to name, the smell of land remembering what it was. She stayed on the fence until the light was gone. The second calf came on a Thursday, just like Eli had predicted, born in the early hours before anyone was awake to see it. Sienna found them at first light, the mother standing in the south section where the buffalo grass had come back thickest, the calf already on its feet, already nursing, already doing the necessary work of being alive. She counted it, wrote it in her own notebook, the one she'd started keeping separate from Eli's because she'd realized at some point that she needed the record to be hers. 20 animals now. The herd was growing. Spring came with the particular speed that spring always has in frontier country. Not gradually, but all at once, like a door opening. The grasses went from the first suggestion of green to something real within 3 weeks, and the bison moved through the recovering pastures with the kind of purpose that Sienna had stopped being surprised by and started being grateful for. She'd learned to read the herd the way her grandfather's journals had suggested, not as individual animals requiring management, but as a system doing what systems do when you stop disrupting them. The extension office sent someone out in April, a young agronomist named Marcus Webb, no relation to Prentice, he clarified immediately, in the way people do when a name carries specific weight in a community, who walked the pastures with a soil probe and a camera and a particular quality of scientific neutrality that Sienna respected because it meant he wasn't going to tell her what she wanted to hear. He spent 4 hours on the property. He took samples from 3 pasture sections and from 2 areas where the bison hadn't been rotated yet, using the unrotated areas as a control. He photographed the grassroot depths by digging small test holes, crouching over each one with a ruler and muttering to himself. He asked Sienna questions she could answer and questions she couldn't, and she answered both kinds with the same directness. Before he left, he stood at the fence line and looked at the main pasture for a moment longer than seemed strictly professional. I want to be careful about what I say to you, he started. Don't be, she said. Just say it. He almost smiled. The organic matter content in your rotated sections is measurably higher than the control areas. Not dramatically. We're talking about a difference that would take most people years to notice. But it's there and it's real. He looked at his notebook. The root depth on the native grass in the section you've had the longest is about 30% deeper than what I'd expect for one season's recovery. Sienna was quiet. That's not nothing, he said. That's actually significant. I'm going to write this up, but I want to come back in the fall and pull more samples before I say anything formal. He paused. What I can tell you informally is that whatever your grandfather theorized, the soil data is moving in the direction he predicted. She shook his hand at the gate. He drove away in an extension office truck with a cracked taillight, and she stood in the access road and looked up at the sky, which was blue and enormous in the way that prairie skies are blue and enormous, and let herself feel the weight of what he'd said for exactly 1 minute. Then she went back to work. What Marcus Webb hadn't said, but what Sienna was already aware of, was that the spring had been dry. Not catastrophically dry. Not yet. But the rain that should have come in March had arrived late and light, and the April rains had been shorter than the almanac suggested. Her grandfather had written about drought years in the journals, not with fear but with a careful, technical interest, describing how the native grass systems responded to stress differently than the monoculture pastures that had replaced them across most of the frontier. The deep roots are the insurance, he'd written. When the surface dries, the deep roots hold. The land remembers water even when it can't find any. By May, the county was talking about it. Not panicking, not yet. But the conversations at the feed store and the Grange and the diner on Route 9 had shifted in the way that ranching conversations shift when people start doing the mental math on water and grass and heat and how many animals they can afford to carry if the summer comes in hard. Harvey Cole was said to be moving some of his cattle to leased land further north, which was the kind of decision that sent a signal because Harvey Cole did not move cattle unless the calculus demanded it. Sienna tracked the moisture data herself, printing the county extension reports and marking them against her grandfather's drought notes. The correlation between what he documented in the dry years of the late 90s and what the forecasts were showing now was close enough to be uncomfortable. She called Eli on a Saturday morning in late May. He'd graduated from biking over to having his older sister drop him off, and in 2 months he'd have his own license, which he mentioned with the casual frequency of someone trying not to seem like it mattered as much as it did. "I need to show you something," she said. He was there within the hour. She spread the journals and the extension reports across the kitchen table and walked him through what she was seeing. He was 17 now, had turned 17 in March without much ceremony. She'd given him a copy of a book on rangeland ecology, and he'd seemed genuinely pleased, which told her everything about what kind of 17-year-old he was. And he followed the data with the focused attention he brought to everything on the ranch. "The soil moisture in the rotated sections," he said, pointing at her notes. "It's holding higher than the surrounding range." "Yeah, because the root depth is retaining it. That's what the data suggests." He sat back. "How bad does the summer have to get before we're in trouble?" She'd been asking herself that question for 2 weeks. "I don't know yet. We've got the advantage my grandfather predicted. If the grassroots systems are as deep as Marcus measured, we can hold moisture longer. But if we go into a serious multi-month drought..." She stopped. "We deal with what's in front of us. I'm not going to plan for the worst case and then act like the worst case is certain." "That's either brave or stubborn," Eli said. "Probably both." He almost smiled. "Your grandfather wrote the same way, actually, in the journals. He never talked about failure like it was the expected outcome." "He also died with a mortgaged ranch and no animals," she said. "So there's a limit to how much credit I'm giving pure stubbornness." The summer arrived like something that had been waiting. June was hot in the way that June sometimes is, aggressively, without apology. And the rain that should have come in the second week didn't come. The creek that ran along the western boundary of the property, which had been running low since April, dropped to a trickle by the end of the month and then to a series of standing pools that shrank visibly from week to week. Sienna dug out the supplemental water lines her grandfather had laid years ago and found that 2 of the 3 still worked, which was better than she'd expected and not as good as she needed. She fixed the 3rd line herself over the course of 2 days with parts from the hardware store and instructions from a plumbing forum she found online at midnight, lying on the floor of the barn with her phone propped against a toolbox. It leaked twice before it didn't. Her knuckles were raw from working in a tight space. She didn't tell anyone how long it took because she was still, at 23, resistant to the idea that she needed help with everything. But the water reached the trough in the north section, and the herd had what they needed. July was when it stopped being a dry year and started being something else. The temperature hit 104 on the 6th of July and stayed above 100 for 11 consecutive days. The creek went dry. 2 of the smaller ponds on neighboring properties dried up completely, and ranchers who had never had to haul water were hauling water. The hay market, which Sienna had been watching with the particular attention of someone who'd built her entire model around not needing hay, went vertical. Prices she'd never seen, driven by the combination of failed cuttings and desperate demand from cattle operations that had bought more animals than their land could carry into a drought. She drove the county road on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-July, and what she saw out the truck windows was the kind of thing you catalog and then try not to think about too much. Brown pastures. Cattle standing in the thin shade of fence lines. A neighbor she didn't know well, a man named Gus Terrell, who ran about 400 head on the property east of the Lyle operation, loading cattle into trailers in what clearly wasn't a planned move. The body language of people doing something they hadn't wanted to do and hadn't expected to be doing. She pulled over and got out. Gus. She didn't know him well enough to call him by his first name with confidence, but she did it anyway. He turned. He was maybe 60, weathered in the specific way of men who work outdoors for decades. Not old exactly, but compressed somehow, like the years had pressed down on him. His expression was the particular blank of a man holding himself together by not allowing his face to do what it wanted to do. Sienna Rowan, he said. Thomas's girl. Granddaughter. She looked at the trailers. Sale barn? Can't afford to feed them. Can't find hay at a price that makes any sense. He took his hat off, wiped his forehead, put it back. Selling at whatever I can get, which isn't much. A pause. Harvey's doing the same. Not all of them. He's got leased pasture up north that's buying him time. But he sold about 2,000 head last week. Heard it was the most painful thing he's done in 30 years. She looked at Gus's pasture behind him. The grass was the yellow-brown color of straw, beaten down and thin, the topsoil cracking in the heat. There were hoof trails worn into it where the cattle had walked the same paths repeatedly, the way cattle do, the same routes until the ground was compacted and bare. Then she looked, almost involuntarily, toward the southwest, toward her own land. She couldn't see it from here, but she knew what was there. How are your bison doing? Gus asked. His voice had a specific quality, not quite casual, not quite direct. The question of a man who has been watching from a distance and is too proud to say so. They're doing fine, she said. Better than fine. He looked at her for a moment. I drove past your property last week. Your grass is still green. I know. He stopped. Seemed to be working out how to say something. That shouldn't be possible. We haven't had meaningful rain in 8 weeks. The root systems are holding moisture, she said. The deep-rooted native grasses, when they come back, they pull water from lower in the soil profile. The bison grazing pattern keeps the ground from compacting, so the water infiltration is better when it does rain, and I've been rotating them so nothing gets overgrazed. She paused. My grandfather understood this. I'm just doing what he wrote down. Gus was quiet for a long moment, then, Thomas used to try to explain that to us, at meetings. A pause. We didn't listen much. I know, she said, not unkindly. She drove home and didn't feel good about the conversation. There was nothing satisfying about being right when the being right was surrounded by other people's losses. The premium inquiry came on an otherwise ordinary Wednesday. An email. She'd set up a ranch email account 6 months in, at Eli's insistence, from a chef in the city. Not a nearby city. A real city, 400 miles away. The kind that had restaurants with waiting lists and menus that changed weekly. His name was Daniel Park, and the email was direct in the way that people who work in professional kitchens tend to be direct. He'd heard about grass-fed bison from the Rowan operation through a contact at the Agricultural Extension Office. He was interested in the quality profile. Did she have animals ready for processing? What were her numbers? She read the email 3 times. Then she called Carla. Do you know anything about this? She asked. Marcus Webb mentioned your operation to some people, Carla said. I may have also mentioned it to someone who mentions things to other people. A pause. Don't be mad. Your product is different from anything else in this region right now. The animals that ate real grass their whole lives on recovering native range during a drought while everything around you burned up, that's a provenance story that a certain kind of buyer pays real money for. I'm not ready to sell yet. I know how many you have. I'm your vet, but you should talk to him anyway. Start building the relationship. She called Daniel Park from the kitchen table with the journals stacked at one end the way they always were. He answered on the second ring and spoke with the focused energy of someone who had about 20 things to do and was giving her his full attention anyway, which she appreciated. Tell me about the pasture rotation, he said, after they'd established the basics. He didn't ask about the animals first. He asked about the land. She told him. She went through it: the native grass recovery, the soil data from the extension office, the drought performance, the grazing pattern. He asked questions that told her he'd done his research. He wasn't a tourist in this conversation. "What I'm looking for," he said finally, "is meat with a story that the actual product backs up. I can find grass-fed on a label anywhere. I can't find grass-fed on genuinely recovering native prairie, managed through a regional drought, with documented soil improvement." A pause. "That's not the same thing." "No," she said, "it's not. What would you need to supply me consistently, starting small?" She did the math in her head. She'd been doing it for weeks already, in the margins of the journals, on the back of extension printouts. "I'm not going to oversell what I have," she said. "I have 22 animals right now. I won't reduce the herd below what the land needs to keep working. Whatever that leaves as surplus, we talk about." He seemed to appreciate the directness. "What's your price thinking?" she told him. It was a number she'd arrived at by looking at what premium grass-fed beef was selling for in the specialty market, and understanding that what she had was not beef, was not from standard grass-fed conditions, and was not produced at the volume that required price concessions. It was a number that would have seemed insane to her 9 months ago at the auction yard with $43 in her account. He didn't flinch. "Let's talk again in the fall," he said. "I want to visit the property first if that's possible." "It's possible," she said. She hung up and sat at the table for a moment with her hand still on the phone. Outside the window, the summer heat was pressing down on everything, the way it had been for weeks, relentless and indifferent. She could see the main pasture from the kitchen, the grass there, green and real, and present in a landscape that had otherwise gone brown. Eli arrived 20 minutes later. He'd been doing that more lately, showing up without a specific plan, which she understood as his way of being present during a stretch that he sensed was significant. He was perceptive in ways that most adults she knew weren't. "You look like something happened," he said, dropping his notebook on the table. "I talked to a restaurant chef in the city. He wants to buy bison." Eli processed this. "At what price?" She told him. He was quiet for a moment. Yeah. Per animal?" "Per animal." He sat down. "Sienna." "I know. That's with 22 animals, even if you only sell." "I know, I'm not getting ahead of it. We're talking in the fall. It's not money yet." But she let herself say the next part. "It might be real, though." He looked out the window at the pasture. Then he opened his notebook and wrote something. She watched him underline it, the same way he always did with things he wanted to remember. "What do you write when you underline it?" she asked. She'd never asked before. He looked up, slightly caught. "I started keeping track of things that turn out to be true," he said. "Things I thought might be real, but wasn't sure about." A pause. "So I can see the pattern later." She looked at him. This 17-year-old with his overstuffed backpack and his broken kickstand bicycle and his careful notebook full of observations, and thought about her grandfather writing in the margins of his journals with the excitement of someone who'd found something true, but had no one nearby who believed it yet. "That's a good system," she said. The county meeting in late July was nothing like the one in October. The room at the Grange Hall had the quality of a space that has absorbed bad news recently and hasn't aired it out yet. Ranchers who in October had been opinionated and certain were quieter now, sitting with the specific stillness of people who have been doing the arithmetic on their own situation and don't like the answers. Harvey Cole was there, in his usual front row position, but he looked different than he had in the fall. Not diminished exactly. Harvey Cole was not a man who diminished easily, but something had shifted in him that showed around the eyes. The weight of 2,000 sold cattle. The weight of 3 decades of a certain way of doing things suddenly performing very differently than it had before. Sienna sat in the back again. She'd been in the back at the October meeting out of uncertainty. She was in the back now out of something different. She wasn't ready to be at the front. She wasn't sure she'd ever be ready for that. Prentice Webb gave a report on drought conditions that was thorough and bleak. Hay prices, water table data, projected recovery timelines if rain came in September versus if it didn't. People asked questions. The answers were not encouraging. Then Margaret Lyle, from the middle of the room said, "Sienna's land is still green." The room went quiet in a specific way. Not the silence of people with nothing to say, but of people recalibrating. "I drove past the Rowan access road yesterday," Margaret continued. She had the deliberate quality of a woman who chose her words in public settings. "The pasture is holding. I want to understand why." All of it landed on Sienna like something she'd been carrying for months and hadn't realized she was about to be asked to set down. She stood up. She talked for about 10 minutes. She didn't have notes. She described the rotation system, the root depth data, the soil moisture retention, the bison grazing pattern, and how it differed from cattle compaction. She was careful not to make it sound like she had all the answers, because she didn't. She was careful not to make it sound like everyone had been doing it wrong, even though by some measures everyone had been doing it wrong. She said what she knew and stopped when she got to the edges of what she knew. When she finished, the room was quiet again. Harvey Cole turned in his chair and looked at her. It was the same look he'd given her at the gate in March, measuring, recalibrating, but with something added now that hadn't been there before. He didn't say anything in the meeting. He waited until afterward, in the parking lot, while the last of the trucks were pulling out. He found her at her own truck, loading the water jugs she'd filled at the hall. "Your grandfather tried to tell me this for 15 years, he said. She waited. "I thought he was wrong." He said it flatly. Not performing regret, not dramatizing the admission, just saying it the way a man says a true thing that costs him something. "I told him he was wrong more than once, in front of people. I used my position in this county to make his ideas seem foolish." A pause. "I want you to know that I know that." "I know you know it," she said. He looked at the middle distance for a moment. "I've got 2,000 fewer cattle than I had in June," he said. "My hay costs for the ones I kept are going to eat my margin for the year, maybe further." Another pause. "I'm not going to lose the operation. I've got enough cushion, but it's the closest I've come in 30 years. "I'm sorry," she said. She meant it. He looked at her. "Are you?" "Yes. I'm not glad you're struggling. I'm just glad the land isn't." He stood there for a moment. A truck went past on the county road, its headlights sweeping the parking lot. Then Harvey Cole did something she hadn't expected. He laughed. Not bitterly. Just the laugh of a man who has heard something that's exactly true and knows it. "Thomas would have liked you," he said. "He always said the land would prove him right eventually. He just never figured it would take this long." He walked to his truck. She watched him go. She drove home in the dark with the windows down, the summer air still warm even at 9 in the evening, carrying the smell of dry grass and dust, and underneath it, something else, the particular smell of her own land, which she'd learned to recognize in the months she'd been on it, green and deep and holding. She pulled up to the ranch, cut the engine, and sat for a minute. From the pasture, she could hear the herd, the occasional movement, the low sound of large animals being present. 22 bison on land that everyone had written off, holding green in the worst drought in a generation. She got out and walked to the fence. She could see Mabel in the moonlight, which wasn't romantic, just practical. The moon was 3/4 full, and the night was clear the way drought nights tend to be. Mabel was grazing in the east section, slow and deliberate, the same way she always did everything. Sienna put her arms on the fence rail and looked at her land. The drought wasn't over. The bank wasn't paid off. The hay prices were still brutal for everyone around her, and 3 of her neighbors had sold animals they'd spent years building up, and nothing about the next year was certain. She hadn't fixed everything. She'd fixed one thing, in one place, imperfectly and expensively, and with the constant anxiety of someone who doesn't know yet whether the ground will hold. But the grass was green, and somewhere in the county, a man with 12,000 head of cattle and 30 years of certainty had just stood in a parking lot and told her that her grandfather had been right all along. She stayed at the fence until the moon moved. Then she went inside, opened the oldest journal, the one from 40 years ago, the one with the most water-damaged pages, and found the entry she'd been thinking about for weeks. "The land will prove it. Not me. The land. I just have to stay long enough for it to happen." She closed the journal and put it back on the shelf. Outside, the herd moved in the dark, heavy and slow and alive. on ground that was still green while everything around it turned to dust. The rain finally came in September. Not dramatically. No single storm that announced the end of the drought and gave everyone a clear moment to exhale. It came the way relief usually comes in real life, which is gradually and incompletely, a few inches over 3 weeks that brought the creek back to a trickle and stopped the visible cracking in the topsoil, but didn't fully answer the damage that 4 months of heat had done to the surrounding range. The brown pastures around Hadley County didn't go green overnight. Some of them didn't go green at all that fall. The root system's too far gone to recover before winter shut everything down. Sienna watched the rain from the barn doorway on the first real day of it, a gray Thursday in early September with water coming off the roof in a steady sheet. The herd was out in it. Bison didn't retreat from rain the way cattle sometimes did, moving through the main pasture with the same unhurried purpose they always had. Mabel had her calf close, the young one now 4 months old and already showing the particular solidity of an animal that had grown up on good ground. The second calf was there too, darker than the first, already nearly half the mother's height. 24 animals now. The herd count had become a quiet ritual. She did it every morning before anything else, the way her grandfather had written that he did it, because the number told you the state of everything. She was still doing the count when Daniel Park arrived for his site visit, pulling up in a rental car that was entirely wrong for the access road and making it anyway, the undercarriage scraping twice on the high center. He got out in clothes that were city clothes, but not foolishly city clothes. He'd made some attempt, and looked at the main pasture with the expression of a man who has driven 400 miles to see something and wants to see it properly before saying anything. Sienna let him look. He was maybe 35, compact and focused, with the kind of alertness that professional kitchens produced in people who stayed in them long enough. He'd brought a small notebook, which she noticed and appreciated. People who brought notebooks to ranches were usually actually paying attention. "I've been to 6 grass-fed operations in the last 2 years," he said, still looking at the pasture. 3 beef, 2 lamb, 1 bison up in the Northern Territory. None of them looked like this. Like what specifically? He turned. Like the land is the point. The others, the animals, were the product, and the land was where you kept them. He looked back at the pasture. This is different. That's what my grandfather believed. Tell me about him. She did, standing at the fence in the September rain, which had settled to a drizzle that neither of them mentioned. She told him about the journals, the 40 years of documentation, the way her grandfather had understood something that the surrounding ranching community had dismissed as either naive or impractical, or both. She told it without sentiment, just factually, the way it had actually happened, including the part where she'd been 3 states away folding hotel laundry when she found out he'd died. Daniel listened with the full attention of someone who isn't just waiting for the part that's useful to him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The drought didn't touch your pasture," he said. "It touched it. It just didn't break it." "That distinction is what I'm paying for," he said. "That's the difference between your product and everything else on a premium menu right now." He opened his notebook. "Walk me through the numbers you're comfortable with." They talked for 2 hours. At the kitchen table with the journals stacked at one end and the extension office soil reports that Marcus Webb had finalized spread between them, she laid out what she had, what she could sustain, what she wouldn't compromise on. She told him the things she couldn't guarantee: weather, herd health, the unpredictability of working with land that was still mid-recovery. And she told him the things she could guarantee, which were fewer but harder. He asked about processing, about transport, about her timeline for sustainable surplus. He asked about the journals and whether the documentation of the grazing system was something he could share with his team. She said yes to that. She asked about payment terms and minimum order commitments. He answered both directly. When they were done, she made coffee, and they sat for a few minutes without the negotiation running between them, just 2 people in a ranch kitchen while the rain came down outside. "One thing I want to say," he said. "I'm going to tell people this story. About your grandfather, about the drought, about what this land did while everything around it failed. I'm not going to embellish it." "You won't need to," she said. He smiled. It was a real smile, not a sales smile. "No, I won't." He left in the afternoon, the rental car making it back down the access road with slightly more confidence than it had come in with. She watched him go, then went to check on the herd, then came inside and sat at the table for a long time doing the math. She'd been afraid to do since the phone call in July. The numbers, laid out plainly on paper, looked different than they'd looked in her head. Not perfect. There was still debt, still the reality of operating a small herd at the volume that quality required, rather than the volume that quick money would have pushed for. But the direction had changed. The slope was different now. She called Carla. "He's serious," she said when Carla picked up. "I know he's serious. I did my homework before I passed your name along." "You could have warned me you were doing that." "I could have," Carla agreed without apology. "How do you feel?" Sienna thought about it. "Like I should tell my grandfather something." Carla was quiet for a moment. "Put it in the journal," she said. "That's what they're for." That night, for the first time since she'd arrived at the ranch, Sienna wrote in one of the journals, not in the middle of one of her grandfather's entries. She found a blank page at the back of the most recent volume and wrote small, the way he had, with the same pen she'd been using to annotate the margins. September. The drought broke. 24 animals. A chef from the city came today. He understood what you were doing here. I think you would have liked him. I think I'm going to be okay. She closed the journal and put it back on the shelf. Then she went to bed and slept better than she had in months. The request that changed everything that fall didn't come from a chef or an agronomist or anyone she'd been expecting. It came from Gus Terrell on a Tuesday morning in October when he showed up at her gate in his truck with his hat in his hands, literally, not figuratively. The hat held against his chest in the posture of a man who has rehearsed something difficult. She was pulling fence staples from a section she was planning to reconfigure, and she saw his truck from across the field and felt the particular wariness of unexpected visitors. She'd gotten better at managing it. She set down the tools and walked to the gate. "Gus." "Sienna." He looked at her pasture, then at her. He was 62, she'd found out from Margaret Lyle, who was the county's informal registry of personal histories. He'd ranched the same land his father had ranched, the same way his father had ranched it, and the drought had cost him 140 animals, and a financial loss he hadn't described to anyone, but that Margaret estimated had set him back 3 or 4 years. "I've got about 350 acres on my east section that's in bad shape," he said. "The grasses are wrong, the soil's compacted. I've got erosion on 2 slopes that I can't seem to stop." He paused. "I was wondering if you'd be willing to come and look at it." She hadn't expected that. "Look at it? And do what?" "Tell me what you think. Tell me if what you're doing here can work there." He turned his hat in his hands. Not a nervous gesture, more like he was keeping his hands occupied so the rest of him could be still. "I know I'm not the first person who came to you with this. Margaret talked to you last week. Prentice is talking about coming by." He looked at her directly. "I'm asking you straight because I don't have years to fix what's wrong with that east section. I'm 62. I need to do something that works." She studied him for a moment. "I'm not a consultant, Gus. I'm running my own operation." "I know that. I also don't have extra animals to lend you. The herd size I'm running is based on what this land can sustain. I can't expand to cover your operation." "I'm not asking for your animals. I'm asking for your knowledge." He said it plainly, without performance. "Whatever your grandfather put in those journals, whatever you've learned in the last year, I'm asking if you'll share it." She looked at the east section of her own property, the section that had been the worst when she arrived, the most compacted, the most invaded by the wrong grasses. She knew what it had looked like in October a year ago, and she knew what it looked like now, and the distance between those two things was a year of work and mistakes and early mornings and the particular slow patience of waiting for ground to do what ground does when you stop preventing it. "I'll come look at it," she said. "That's all I'm committing to right now." She drove to Gus Terrell's east section the following Saturday with her grandfather's journals in a bag on the passenger seat. She walked the land for 3 hours, not with Gus following her, which she asked him not to do, because she needed to read the land without someone watching her face for reactions. She took notes. She photographed the soil in 3 locations, the slope erosion, the grass species she could identify, the areas where the ground was so compacted that water ran off it rather than soaking in. When she was done, she sat on the tailgate of her truck and looked at what she'd written. "Okay," she told him, "here's what I see." She talked for 40 minutes. She was honest. The east section was in worse shape than she'd hoped, and recovery wasn't going to be fast. 2 of the slopes were going to need specific intervention before any grazing management could work, because the erosion had gone far enough that the topsoil wasn't there to support regrowth without help. The compaction issue was fixable, but would take time and the right animals moving across it in the right pattern. "Do you know anyone who could loan you some cattle for a different kind of rotation?" she asked. "Cattle are what got me here." "Cattle managed the wrong way got you here," she said. "Cattle managed right, moved frequently across the right sections in the right timing. It's not as effective as bison, but it's something," she paused. "Or you wait until I have surplus animals and we talk about a different arrangement. But that's at minimum a year from now, maybe 2. "What would you do if it was your land?" She thought about that. "I'd start with the 2 worst slopes, get those stabilized. Then I'd rethink the rotation on everything else. Move faster, rest longer, stop grazing anything that's already stressed." She looked at her notes. "And I'd read my grandfather's journals, except you don't have those. So I'll write you something." He looked at her. "You'd do that?" "It's what he would have done," she said. "He spent 30 years trying to get people to listen. The least I can do is write it down for someone who's finally ready to." She spent the next 2 weeks writing. Not a formal document, nothing academic, just a practical guide based on the journals and her own first year of implementation. What to look for, what to avoid, how to read the signs that the land was recovering versus the signs that you were still in damage mode. She wrote it in the same plain, direct language her grandfather had used, without the scientific terminology that Marcus Webb had layered on top of it in his extension report. She wrote it for a 62-year-old rancher who needed to fix his land, not for a journal submission. She gave it to Gus on a Sunday afternoon. She gave copies to Margaret Lyle and Prentice Webb the same week, because they'd both asked, and because she'd made enough copies while she was making one. Margaret read the first 3 pages, standing at her own gate while Sienna waited. She had the reading expression of someone moving through something faster than she wanted to, but unable to slow down. "This is what Thomas was trying to say," she said, not looking up. "This is exactly what he was trying to say." "He said it better," Sienna told her, "in the journals. But this is the short version." Prentice Webb took his copy, thanked her with the contained formality of a man not accustomed to being in the position of receiving something, and told her he'd be in touch. She knew he would. He was the kind of man who followed through on things he said. Harvey Cole came on a Wednesday in late October. She saw his truck at the gate from the barn and had the same involuntary reaction she always had to his truck, a kind of stealing, a preparation. It had been 3 months since the parking lot conversation after the Grange meeting. She'd seen him twice from a distance in town. They hadn't spoken. She walked to the gate. He was standing outside his truck, not looking at the pasture this time, looking at the access road, at the ground, at the gate hardware, the small, specific things that people look at when they're building up to something. "Harvey, I need to ask you something," he said. He got there faster than she'd expected, which told her he'd been thinking about it for a while and had decided the preamble wasn't serving him. "I've got a grandson, Ryan. He's 14. Smart kid. Too smart sometimes, the way 14-year-olds can be. He's been asking me questions about the land that I can't answer the way I want to." He paused. "The kind of questions that, if I'm being straight with you, your grandfather was asking 30 years ago." She waited. "I'd like him to spend some time here, learning what you're doing, what your grandfather documented." He said the next part carefully, the way a large man sets something fragile down. "I spent 30 years not learning it myself. I'd like my grandson to have it while he's still young enough for it to change how he works." The silence between them had the particular quality of something that had been a long time coming. She thought about what it had cost him to drive to her gate and say that. Harvey Cole had 12,000 head of cattle and 3 ranches and a position in this county that he'd built over 3 decades of work and certainty. He'd laughed at her at the auction. He'd told her grandfather he was wrong, more than once, in public, in the way that men with gravity can tell other men things in public, in ways that land differently than private conversations. He'd offered to buy this land twice and been turned down twice, and responded to that with what she suspected was a genuine but poorly expressed concern rather than malice. He was not a villain. He was a man who had been very certain for a very long time, and the drought had done what no argument could. It had shown him the cost of that certainty in a language he could not ignore. "Send him on a Saturday," she said. "He can work with Eli. They're close in age. Eli's 17. He's been here almost a year. He knows the system about as well as anyone." Harvey looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the measuring look, not the recalibrating look. Something more open than either of those. "I owe you an apology," he said. "More than one. I owe your grandfather's memory an apology that I can't deliver." He stopped. "I'm saying this badly." "You're saying it fine," she said. "People don't usually say it at all." "I was wrong about the land," he said, "and I used my position in this county to make a man who was right feel like he was foolish. I've been thinking about that since July." He looked at the gate, then at her. "I'm sorry." Wait. She received it the way it was intended. Not as the end of something, but as the beginning of a different arrangement. "I'll see Ryan on Saturday," she said. He nodded, got back in his truck. She waited for him to drive away before she moved, and she stood in the access road for a moment in the October light, breathing the fall air that had lost the drought heat and gone cool and clean. She wasn't sure what she'd expected to feel when Harvey Cole apologized to her. Some version of triumph, maybe. The satisfaction of having been right in a way that the person who doubted you had to finally admit. But what she actually felt was just tired, and something underneath the tired that was closer to sad than anything else. Sad for her grandfather, who had been right for 30 years without ever getting the apology. Sad for the drought losses that had made the apology possible. Sad in the specific way you feel when something you'd been hoping for arrives after the moment when it would have meant the most. She went back to the barn and finished what she'd been doing before Harvey arrived. She pulled the staples she'd been pulling, repositioned the fence section, drove the new staples with the proper technique Eli had taught her a year ago. She cut her hand once, the same two knuckles that always seemed to find the wire, and stood there for a moment pressing them against her jeans while the blood stopped. Ryan Cole arrived the following Saturday in a truck his grandfather drove him in, dropped at the gate with a small backpack and the specific social uncertainty of a 14-year-old who has been told to do something by an adult and isn't sure what to expect from it. He was a lean kid, dark-haired, with his grandfather's direct eyes, but none of his grandfather's arrived certainty. He had the eyes of someone still gathering information about the world, still deciding what he thought. He shook Sienna's hand with a firm grip that someone had taught him and said, "Thank you for having me," in a way that sounded slightly rehearsed, which she forgave immediately. Eli was already at the fence line when they walked over, writing in his notebook with the morning light coming in flat and gold from the east. He looked up, assessed Ryan in the quick way he did everything, and said, "You want to see something that'll make you feel like your grandfather's operation makes no sense?" Ryan blinked. "Okay." "Come look at the soil in the east section. I've been documenting it since October last year. I'll show you what changed." They went. Sienna watched them walk toward the fence line, the 17-year-old with his notebook and the 14-year-old with his backpack and the particular energy of young people beginning to talk about something that matters. And she felt something that was complicated and warm and hard to name exactly. She went to check the water lines. The weeks that followed had a quality she hadn't anticipated, the quality of something expanding past the boundaries she'd originally imagined for it. Margaret Lyle came by twice to ask specific questions about the written guide. Prentice Webb sent his son, a man in his 30s named Cal, to spend a day walking the pastures with Eli, who had become, without formal appointment or any conversation about it, the person who showed people around the operation. He was good at it. He was patient and specific and honest about the things that hadn't worked as well as the things that had, which was exactly the quality that made it useful. Ryan came back the second Saturday without being asked. He came back the third Saturday and the fourth, and by the fifth he was showing up with questions written in a notebook of his own. Specific, considered questions about soil composition and grazing timing and how you knew when a section was ready to be grazed again versus when it needed more rest. Eli answered them with the same care he gave everything he did. Sienna watched this happening and thought about her grandfather's journals. The 11 volumes on the shelf in the kitchen, 40 years of observation and theory and patience, and the particular frustration of a man who understood something that nobody around him was ready to understand yet. He'd kept writing anyway. He'd kept the land anyway. He'd turned down Harvey Cole's father's money and Harvey Cole's money because he believed the knowledge was worth more than the transaction. He'd been right. He just needed someone to come after him and do the part that came next. She started writing in the journals more regularly now, not replacing his entries, but continuing them in the back pages of each volume. Dates, herd counts, pasture conditions, what was working and what wasn't. The first sale to Daniel Park, which happened in November, and netted her enough to pay down a significant portion of the remaining mortgage and refill the emergency fund she'd been drawing from since October of the previous year. The second inquiry, from a restaurant in a different city that Daniel had apparently mentioned the operation to. The soil report from Marcus Webb's fall visit, which used the word significant 3 times in 2 pages, which, for an extension office agronomist writing a formal report, was approximately the equivalent of shouting. She wrote all of it in the same careful handwriting her grandfather had used, in the same practical language, with the same attention to the specific details. The root depths, the grass species, the moisture readings, the herd behavior, that he'd believed were worth documenting even when no one was watching. One evening in late November, Ryan Cole sat at the kitchen table with Eli, and 2 of the journals open between them while Sienna made dinner at the stove. A real dinner, not a peanut butter sandwich, the kind of meal that had become more possible in the last 2 months. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop. The kitchen wasn't big enough to not hear. "He knew all this 40 years ago?" Ryan said. He was looking at one of the older journals, the one with the most water damage, squinting slightly at the handwriting. "He figured it out over time," Eli said. "You can see it change. The early entries are more uncertain. The later ones, he'd worked it out. He just couldn't get anyone to try it." "Why didn't anyone listen?" Eli considered. "I think because it meant admitting that the way they'd been doing things was wrong. And people who've done something for 30 years don't love being told they've been doing it wrong." He paused. "Even when the evidence is right there." Ryan was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather had 30 years. "I know. Do you think he feels bad about it?" Eli glanced toward the stove, not checking whether Sienna was listening, she thought, but something more like acknowledging that the question had weight that touched more than the 2 of them. "I think he's trying to do something about it," he said. "That's probably the better question." Sienna turned the burner down and said nothing. After dinner, after Eli and Ryan had gone, Eli biking home in the dark with the good flashlight she'd started keeping for him, Ryan picked up by his grandfather, who waited at the gate without coming in, respecting some boundary that she hadn't stated but he'd apparently perceived. She sat at the table with the oldest journal and a cup of tea and the quiet that had become her company. She thought about the last 14 months, the $43, the 18 sick animals, the community meeting where she'd stood in the back row and felt the room's skepticism like weather, the wire cuts and the frozen water lines and the cold coffee and the February storm and the drought and the morning when Marcus Webb had stood at her fence and used the word significant, and the night when Harvey Cole had stood in a parking lot and told her that her grandfather had been right. None of it had been smooth. Most of it had been hard in ways she hadn't fully prepared for, which was probably the only honest thing you could say about the first year of building anything real. She'd been wrong about some things. She'd been scared more often than she'd let on. She'd eaten too many gas station sandwiches and slept too few hours and called her mother twice from the porch in the dark because she needed to hear a voice that wasn't the wind. But the land was recovering, the herd was growing, the debt was shrinking. And in the kitchen on Saturday mornings, a 17-year-old with a broken kickstand bicycle and a 14-year-old with his grandfather's eyes and a notebook of his own were reading the words of a man who died before his ideas were proven and finding them as useful as anything they'd been taught. She opened the most recent journal to the back pages where she'd been writing. She picked up her pen. November, 26 animals. Second calf from this year is putting on weight well ahead of schedule. Ryan Cole has been here 5 Saturdays in a row. He asks better questions every week. Eli says he's a natural. I think my grandfather would find this either deeply satisfying or profoundly funny, and I'm not sure which." She paused, added one more line. "I think the land is starting to trust us back." She closed the journal and left it on the table, the way she always did now, not putting it back on the shelf, but keeping it within reach. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and outside in the dark the herd moved slowly across recovering ground, and the November stars were out, and everything that needed to happen was happening, slowly and imperfectly, and exactly as it should. 3 years after the drought, Hadley County looked different from the air. Sienna knew this because Marcus Webb had shown her the satellite imagery during one of his quarterly visits, the kind of before and after comparison that made the data real in a way that soil samples couldn't quite achieve. The 2019 imagery showed the county in the worst of the drought, a patchwork of brown and tan with one stubborn green rectangle in the southwest quadrant that was the Rowan Ranch, surrounded on all sides by land that had given up. The 2022 imagery was different. Not green everywhere, nothing was ever green everywhere, but recovering. Sections that had been bare soil were showing native grass return. The creek corridor that ran through 3 properties had vegetation along its banks again. The overall color of the county, viewed from whatever altitude the satellite used, had shifted from the yellow-brown of defeat to something more complicated and alive. "The interesting thing," Marcus said, pointing at a section on the screen, "is that the recovery pattern follows the properties where people implemented the rotation changes. It's not random. You can actually see the methodology in the landscape." She'd looked at the image for a long time without saying anything. "Your grandfather would have wanted to see this?" Marcus said. "Yeah," she said, "he would have." What the satellite image couldn't show was everything that had happened between the drought and the morning Marcus spread the printout on her kitchen table. It couldn't show the conversations and the difficult admissions and the slow, unglamorous work of people changing how they did things after doing them a different way for decades. It couldn't show Gus Terrell's east section going from cracked hardpan to something that held water and grew grass, a process that had taken 2 full years and a lot of mistakes that Gus had called her about on evenings when he was frustrated and needed to hear that the mistakes were part of it. It couldn't show Prentice Webb's son Cal driving out every few months with new questions, or Margaret Lyle's decision to reduce her cattle numbers voluntarily, a decision that had cost her short-term income and that she'd made anyway because the math on the long term had finally become undeniable. And it couldn't show Ryan Cole. Ryan was 17 now, a junior in high school, and he'd been coming to the Rowan Ranch on Saturdays for 3 years with such consistency that she'd stopped thinking of it as something that needed to be arranged. He just appeared, the way Eli had appeared in the beginning. Bicycle replaced by his own truck now, the notebook replaced by a newer one with more pages. The rehearsed politeness of his first visit long since dissolved into the easy familiarity of someone who knew where the tools were kept and how to read the water trough levels and which sections of the herd were in which pasture rotation without being told. Eli had gone to the State Agricultural College on a partial scholarship 2 years ago. His leaving had created a gap that was more than practical. He'd been the first person besides Sienna who had believed in the thing from close enough to matter, and she'd felt it more than she'd expected. He called on Sundays. He sent papers he was writing about rangeland ecology with specific sections highlighted in the margin note. This is what you figured out before the research caught up. She kept the papers in a folder in the kitchen drawer and felt something between pride and the particular ache of watching people you care about move into their own futures. But Ryan had stepped into the space Eli left in the way that felt, not like replacement, because nothing replaced Eli's particular brand of quiet intensity, but like continuation, like the thing was passing forward the way it was supposed to. She thought about that on the morning of the funeral. Dr. Carla Shen died on a Tuesday in early spring, quietly and without much warning, the way people sometimes do when they've spent their lives paying attention to everyone else's health instead of their own. She was 61. She'd had a cardiac event in February that she'd described to Sienna on the phone as an inconvenience, and to her cardiologist, apparently, as something she'd deal with after the spring calving season, which was the kind of answer that made sense only to people who had spent their careers being the last line of defense for animals that couldn't advocate for themselves. She was the person who had told Sienna, in October of the first year, that she couldn't evaluate whether the grazing system would work from a veterinary standpoint, but that she'd been watching cattle operations in the county get worse for 15 years and didn't know what the right answer was. She was the person who had quietly passed Sienna's name to Marcus Webb, and through Marcus to Daniel Park, and had never made a point of it or asked for acknowledgement. She had been the unglamorous kind of support, the kind that shows up and tells you the truth and does the next practical thing and doesn't require you to be grateful about it. The funeral was small. Carla had been private in the way that people who work with animals sometimes are, more comfortable with the company of creatures that don't need you to explain yourself. The county was represented by maybe 30 people, a mix of ranchers and former clients, and a few people from the veterinary college where she'd occasionally taught. Sienna sat in the middle pews. Harvey Cole was toward the back. She noticed him when she came in, and they'd nodded to each other in the way they did now. Not warmly exactly, but with the acknowledgement of people who have built a functional understanding on the ruins of an adversarial beginning. After the service, at the small reception in the church hall, Harvey found her by the coffee. "She was the first vet who ever told me something was my fault," he said. "Not the animal's fault. Not bad luck. Mine." He poured coffee with the careful attention of a man who needs something to do with his hands. "I didn't like it, but she was right. She usually was," Sienna said. "She told me, the year before the drought, that my pasture rotation was going to cost me." He paused. "I told her I'd been running cattle longer than she'd been alive, and I thought I understood my own land." He looked at his coffee. "I've been thinking about that conversation a lot this past year." "Harvey." He looked up. "You changed," she said. "That's not nothing. A lot of people don't." He was quiet for a moment. "Ryan told me something last week," he said. "He said that the way you teach is by showing people what's possible, not by telling them what they're doing wrong." He looked at her directly. "He said he learned that from you." She didn't know what to say to that, which was unusual. She settled for, "He figured most of it out himself." That's what good teachers always say. She drove home from the funeral on the county road with the windows down and the spring air coming in, the same road she'd driven hundreds of times in the 3.5 years since she'd arrived in Hadley County with a dying truck and $43 and her grandfather's debt. The land on either side of the road looked different than it had in those first weeks. She wasn't imagining it. The satellite image was real, and what her eyes were telling her matched it. The grass was different, the color was different, the quality of the landscape had shifted in the particular way that takes years to accomplish, and then, once accomplished, seems like it must always have been that way. She pulled over once, not for any mechanical reason, just to look. She got out and stood on the road shoulder and looked at a section of range that had been Gus Terrell's worst pasture in the drought year. It was native grass now, mixed species, the kind of ground cover that her grandfather's journals had described as the goal, not monoculture, not engineered, but the complicated living system that this land had carried before a century of the wrong kind of management had replaced it with something simpler and more fragile. Gus had called her about this section 6 months ago, when the grass came back properly for the first time. He'd been uncharacteristically inarticulate on the phone. She'd heard him start 2 sentences and stop, which was not how Gus Terrell normally communicated. Finally, he'd said, "I wish Thomas was here to see it." She hadn't known how to answer that, so she'd said, "Me too," and they'd stayed on the phone in silence for a moment before they both hung up. She stood on the road shoulder in the spring light and thought about her grandfather. She thought about him more often than she talked about him, which was how grief tended to work when you came to know someone better after they were gone than you'd managed while they were alive. She knew his handwriting now the way she knew the layout of her own kitchen. She knew which margins he'd annotated in excitement and which in frustration. She knew the entry where he'd come closest to giving up, a winter entry, 4 years before his death, where the handwriting was less careful than usual, and the tone had a worn-down quality she recognized from her own worst nights. And she knew the entry 3 weeks later where he seemed to have decided to keep going, though he didn't explain what changed his mind. She'd added her own entry the night she read that one. "I think he just got up the next morning and went back to work. I think that's all it was." She got back in the truck and drove home. The herd was at 63 animals the spring Carla died. The original 18, minus 2 that had died in the first winter, losses that had hurt more than she'd expected, and that she'd recorded in the journals with the same care as everything else, because you didn't get to only document the good parts. had grown through 4 calving seasons into a population that the property could support and that the market, small and deliberate and increasingly interested, could absorb at the rate she was willing to sell. She hadn't rushed the numbers. That had been a choice that cost her money in the short term and that she'd made anyway, because the thing she was building was not a volume business. Daniel Park had brought 2 other chefs to the property over the past 2 years, both of whom had left with contracts, and both of whom had used the word provenance in ways that would have seemed strange to her before she understood that what she was selling was not just meat, but evidence. Evidence that land managed a certain way could produce something that land managed the conventional way simply couldn't replicate. The premium was real. It had paid off the mortgage in full the previous October. She'd driven to the bank herself to make the final payment because some things needed to be done in person. And it had funded the fence replacement she'd been deferring for 2 years and the water system upgrade that Marcus Webb had been recommending since his first site visit. She was not wealthy. She was not even particularly comfortable in the way that word implied security from future difficulty. But she was solvent, and the land was healthy, and those 2 facts together meant something that she hadn't been entirely sure was possible when she'd stood at that auction in October 3.5 years ago with her hand in the air. Ryan Cole came on the Saturday after Carla's funeral, the same as every other Saturday, which was its own kind of comfort, the reliability of someone who shows up because they want to be there rather than because they're obligated to. He found her in the east section, doing the thing she still did herself every season, regardless of how many other things needed doing, checking the soil by hand, pressing a handful of it together, feeling the texture, looking at the color, crumbling it apart and smelling it. Her grandfather had done this in the journals. She'd found his descriptions of soil smell changes over time, the language he used, the distinctions he made between what recovering soil smelled like versus depleted soil. And she'd thought it was unusual when she first read it and then discovered, the first time she did it herself, that he was exactly right. There was a smell to healthy ground that you couldn't get from a laboratory report. "How's it reading?" Ryan asked, crouching next to her. She handed him a handful from the section they were standing in. He took it, pressed it, crumbled it. He'd been doing this long enough to know what he was feeling for. "Better than last fall," he said. "Yeah." He looked at the section around them, the mixed native grass, the bison trails that crossed it in the pattern she'd learned to read as a sign of healthy movement rather than overuse. "I've been thinking about something," he said. She waited. Ryan had learned, somewhere in 3 years of Saturdays, that she didn't rush people out of their thinking. "I want to study range management," he said. "At college. Formally." He paused. "My grandfather thinks I should study business and take over the cattle operation." "What do you think?" "I think the cattle operation needs someone who understands the land more than someone who understands the business." He brushed the soil off his hands. "I think those things should be the same, but they're usually not." She looked at him, 17, with his grandfather's direct eyes and his own hard-won understanding of ground that took years to read properly. "What does your grandfather say when you tell him that?" "He says I'm probably right." Ryan almost smiled, which is new. She thought about Harvey Cole at the funeral, talking about Carla's truthfulness, about Ryan telling him that teaching meant showing what was possible, about the 14-year-old who'd arrived at her gate with a rehearsed handshake 3 years ago and was now crouching in her east section reading Soil by Feel and talking about range management, the way someone talks about a vocation they've already committed to privately and are only now saying out loud. "Apply where you want to apply," she said. "Come back in the summers. There's always work here, and I'll teach you what I know, which is less than what's in the journals and more than what's in any curriculum." She paused. "And tell your grandfather I said his cattle operation will be in better hands with someone who understands the land than someone who just understands the spreadsheet." He laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind he didn't produce often. "He'll argue about that." "He'll argue and then he'll think about it for 2 weeks and decide you're right," she said. "That's how he works. It just takes him a minute." The afternoon light was coming in low across the pasture when she put the journals on the kitchen table for what felt like a ceremonial purpose, though she wouldn't have called it that. She'd been building to something for a few weeks, and hadn't known exactly what it was until the morning after the funeral, when she'd woken early and lain in bed listening to the herd in the near pasture and understood what she needed to do. She got all 11 volumes down from the shelf, plus the 2 she'd filled herself in the last 3 years. 13 journals total, spanning from the early 1980s to the present. A continuous record of one family's understanding of one piece of land. She stacked them on the table in order, the way she'd read them. The oldest first, water damaged, her grandfather's handwriting young and uncertain in the early pages, becoming more assured and more specific as the decades accumulated. Her own volumes at the end, her handwriting different from his, but the language similar. The same plain attention to the same kinds of things. The continuity visible on the page if you knew to look for it. She sat down and wrote the last entry. She didn't plan it in advance. She just started writing and let it be what it was. Spring, year 4. 63 animals. The mortgage is paid. Carla Shin died this week, which the county will feel for years in ways people don't fully understand yet. Marcus Webb's satellite comparison shows the land pattern shifting across the county. You can see the methodology in the landscape from altitude, which I think you would have found either gratifying or amusing, probably both. Ryan Cole is going to study range management. Harvey apologized to me formally, twice, and means it. Gus Terrell's East section is back. The journals are going on the shelf after this, not because the story is finished, it isn't and won't be, but because this part of it is complete enough to stand on its own. She paused. Then, you were right about the land. You were right about the animals. You were right about the patience it takes, and the particular kind of stubbornness required, and the fact that the evidence eventually accumulates whether or not anyone is ready to see it. I wish you'd had more time to watch it happen. I wish I'd listened harder when you were alive. I wish a lot of things that don't change anything. But the herd is healthy. The ground is recovering. The boy who used to be the cattle king's only hope for a dynasty is going to go learn how to read soil at a university. And then he's going to come back here and keep doing the work. That's more than enough. That might be everything. She set the pen down. Read what she'd written once. Then she stacked the journals carefully, in order, and carried them to the shelf beside the fireplace where her grandfather had kept them, and where she had found them on the night she arrived with cold coffee and the particular hollowness of a person who doesn't know what they've inherited yet. She put them back. She stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet of a late spring afternoon, listening to the house settle and the wind come across the open land from the west. Then she went outside. The main pasture was in the middle of the afternoon light, the kind that made the native grass look like it was lit from underneath. Mabel was in the far section, 8 years old now, enormous and calm, the matriarch of the herd in whatever sense Bison had matriarchs, which Sienna had come to believe was more than anyone gave them credit for. 3 of the current calves grazed near her, born this spring, still carrying the dark color of young bison that would lighten as they aged. Ryan was at the east fence line, writing in his notebook. She could see him from the barn, the 17-year-old who would leave for college in the fall and come back in the summers, and eventually, she suspected, build something of his own that carried what he'd learned here forward into the next chapter of the county's land history. He didn't know yet exactly what shape that would take. Neither did she. Neither of them needed to. She walked to the fence and stood next to him without saying anything. He didn't look up from the notebook, which she'd learned meant he was in the middle of something he needed to finish. After a moment, he closed it. They stood at the fence together in the afternoon light, looking at the pasture. "What were you writing?" she asked. "Soil moisture notes from the east section," he said. "And then something else." "What?" He was quiet for a moment in the way he got quiet before he said something that mattered to him. "I was writing about what it looks like when a piece of land comes back," he said. "I've been watching it happen for 3 years, and I still don't have the right words for it. It's not dramatic. It's not fast. It's just one season it looks one way, and the next season it looks different, and after enough seasons you look back at where it started, and you can't quite believe it's the same ground." She looked at the pasture, at the deep-rooted native grass that had replaced the thin, compacted cover she'd found when she arrived, at the soil that held water, now instead of shedding it, at the herd moving the way the herd moved, purposeful, unhurried, doing the work that 60 years of research had confirmed, and that her grandfather had understood before the research caught up. "That's the right words," she said. He looked at her. Which part? All of it. She put her arms on the fence rail, the familiar posture of 4 years of standing at this fence, watching the land do what land does when you stop fighting it. You can't rush it. You can't force it. You just have to keep doing the right thing and let time do the part that only time can do. Ryan nodded slowly, the way he did when he was filing something. He'd be gone in 4 months, and the Saturdays would change shape, and the ranch would keep running the way she'd built it to run, not dependent on any single person's presence, but carrying the understanding that everyone who'd worked there had added to it. She thought about the night she'd arrived, the sagging porch, the mismatched shingles, the journals on the shelf she hadn't known yet how to read, the $43, the 18 sick animals she'd bought because a dead man's handwriting had told her something true. She'd been 23 years old and terrified in ways she hadn't fully admitted to herself, making a decision that everyone she'd encountered in the county thought was at best naive, and at worst the kind of mistake that would cost her everything. They hadn't been entirely wrong to be skeptical. It could have gone differently. The first calf might not have survived. The drought might have been worse or come earlier, before the root systems had time to establish. The mortgage terms could have been less manageable. She could have been wrong about any of a dozen things she'd decided to believe because her grandfather had written them down. She hadn't been wrong. The land hadn't been wrong. But she also understood now, in a way she hadn't at 23, that the outcome didn't retroactively justify the risk. The risk had been real. The fear had been real. The night she'd sat at the kitchen table with bad coffee doing math that didn't work and a truck that needed repairs she couldn't afford, those had been real, and they would have been real regardless of how the story turned out. You didn't get to look back from a green pasture and say it had never been hard. It had been hard every single day for the first year and most of the second. What you got to say was that it had been worth it. Not because the money came in, though the money coming in mattered practically. Not because Harvey Cole apologized, though his apology had been real and it had landed in a place in her that needed it. Not because the satellite image showed the county shifting towards something better, though she looked at that image sometimes when she needed to remember that individual effort accumulated into something larger than any one person. What made it worth it was the thing she couldn't have articulated at 23 and could barely articulate now, which was this. She had kept faith with something her grandfather believed, on ground that everyone had dismissed, against the weight of a community's certainty that she was wrong, for long enough that the land itself demonstrated the truth of it. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, the only kind of thing that lasted. The afternoon was going gold at the edges, the way afternoons in this part of the frontier did when the light was right, that particular color that existed only in the last hour before the sun went down, when the grass and the sky had a conversation about warmth that you could see but not quite describe. Mabel looked up from grazing, the way she occasionally did, and looked in Sienna's direction with the incurious calm that she'd had since the auction. The calf nearest to her did the same, mimicking the posture with the automatic imitation of the young. Ryan closed his notebook and tucked it under his arm. "Same time next Saturday?" he said. "Same time," she said. He walked to his truck. She heard the engine turn over, heard the tires on the gravel access road, heard the truck reach the county road, and then the sound fade into the ordinary quiet of a property that had learned, over 4 years, to simply be what it was. She stayed at the fence. The herd moved in the evening light, 63 animals on ground that had come back from the edge of things, and the native grass held under their hooves the way her grandfather had said it would. And the land that everyone in the county had once looked at and seen nothing in was doing the thing it had always been capable of doing, given the right animals and enough patience and one stubborn young woman who had decided, for reasons she hadn't been entirely able to explain at the time, to trust a dead man's handwriting over every living voice that told her she was wrong. She breathed the spring air. She stayed until the light was gone. Then she turned, walked across the recovering ground to the house her grandfather had left her, went inside, and started on whatever came next.